21. Everybody having a good time?
Yeah.
What? Yeah. Everything very much. So, good morning. My name is Chris Mackowski. I'm editor-in-chief of Emerging Civil War. And you have no idea how excited I am to come all the way to Gettysburg to kill Stonewall Jackson today, which I normally get to do in my own backyard in Chancellorsville. So kind of a nice change of venue. Before I get started, I first want to introduce the man, the myth, the legend, Ted Savas, ladies and gentlemen. Yay. I told him if he didn't show up here at 8 o'clock this morning, I would smother him with his own pillow. So thank you for being here. Sarah Clausen, ladies and gentlemen, she is one of the masterminds that actually runs things at Savas Beatie. I would like to call attention to her, even though she's a shy person, but we have so many things that happen behind the scenes to get a book into your hands. And Sarah really is instrumental in that behind the scenes process. So the products and the stories and the books that you get to enjoy happen, not just because of Ted's vision, but because of Sarah making it happen. So I just want to publicly say thank you for the work that you do.
Hear, hear.
Yes. Before everybody get a copy of the map. I made a little map packet. Everybody likes maps. So I figured if nothing else, everyone will have a takeaway and be like, he was really boring, but I got these maps. So that would be good. I also just want to introduce a few of my colleagues from Emerging Civil War. I know many of you are great supporters of our organization. There are about 32 of us that are currently working at the blog right now. Free content every day. EmergingCivilWar.com. And our mission is to spread the gospel of the Civil War, helping people stay connected with what we believe is America's defining event. And we'd love to have you as part of that conversation. So please join us online. I'll see if I can hit everybody. Derek Maxfield, author of our book on Elmira. He also has a book coming out next year, a biography on William T. Sherman called Man of Fire. Not sure where everybody's standing. Sarah K. Byerly, she's the brains behind the operation. She's the managing editor of the blog, author of Call Out the Cadets, The Battle of Newmarket. She's working on a Pelham biography, so it's no wonder she's gravitating to the cannon close behind her, right there behind her. Terry Rensel, executive director of the Central Virginia Battlefields Trust. Terry has been doing a lot of work on our editorial board. Real interested in the regiments from Erie, Pennsylvania. If you're down at Little Round Top today, take your hat off in memory of Strong Vincent on Terry's behalf. Brad Gottfried, author of our brand new book, Lincoln Comes to Gettysburg, Creation of the Soldiers' National Cemetery and the Gettysburg Address. Brad's got a list of books as long as my arm, so I won't be able to go through them there, but of particular note to you would be his Maps book series, which are fantastic full-color maps that Brad works on, extensively researches. They're wonderful tools to take out with you on the battlefield. I highly urge you to pick those up. I see John Michael Priest, who's not written for us, but I like him anyway, and he's a good guy, so I'm just going to call him out there. That's right, he has written an article for us, that's right. That's a sweet. Mike Scott, who's done some audiobook work for us. He's working currently on Dwight Hughes's Unlike Anything That Ever Floated. The Monitor, Virginia, and Battle of Hampton Roads will be Mike's next work for us, so thank you for your fine audio work for us. Eric Cole helps with our social media. He's also a volunteer at the Elmira prison camp, so he and Derek are actually our two Elmira experts here, but thanks to Eric, we got lots of great stuff going on our social media. And Brian Swartz, author of our brand new book on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. I feel like I should take my hat off when I mention our Lord and Savior, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. So Brian comes to us all the way from Hamden, Maine, which is just outside of Bangor, and down here to celebrate the weekend. So Brian, thanks for being with us as well. Lots of familiar faces from the Emerging Civil War Symposium from last weekend, lots of new faces. So it's really just a delight to be out here with you on this battlefield this morning. If you guys have any questions at any time, I'll be glad to take them. I'll stick around afterwards. And like any good drug dealer, I have books in the trunk of my car. So if you guys want to deal books later on, I'll be happy. That's for Ted's purposes there, make the boss happy. As I mentioned, I'm based out of Fredericksburg. I've had the privilege to share the story of Stonewall Jackson at the Chancellorsville battlefield, at the site where Jackson has died. I've never come here to Gettysburg to kill him off. So that's kind of a new thing for me. Thank you for being with me. And I think that the story of Jackson is inextricably tied to Gettysburg, because how many of you have ever wondered, like, well, what if Jackson was there, right? William C. Davis calls that the most asked Civil War what if. What if Jackson was at Gettysburg? Terry Renzel has a great answer for that, ladies and gentlemen. Terry?
He'd be missing one arm and be in an advancing state of decomposition.
That's right. If Stonewall Jackson was here.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I will not be taking questions at this time.
That's right. And it is literally a TED Talk, since this is a Ted Savage production, right? So perhaps a better way to ask that question is, what if Stonewall Jackson lived? And I think that my favorite answer to that question is actually a set of alternative history novels written by a guy named R.E. Thomas called Stonewall Goes West. Great brain candy if you're interested. Stonewall survives his wounding, comes back right after Brandy Station. Things in the West are looking pretty iffy, so he actually gets sent out to take over for Braxton Bragg out at Chattanooga. Takes John Bell Hood with him, and then he squares off against William T. Sherman, Derek's guy. So kind of a lot of fun. So what if Jackson lives? We can take those sorts of questions all over the place if we want to. What I want to do today is really ground us in the question itself and the assumptions that underlie that question, because I would argue we can't even get him here to Gettysburg. But let's say we somehow do, and we just drop him in whole. What does that look like too? And so we're going to explore that a little bit as well, because I think Richard Ewell, who shows up here at Gettysburg, his big crime is that he's not Stonewall Jackson. But I think we can kind of draw some pretty close parallels. So that's kind of where we're going. Every time we ask, what if Stonewall Jackson was at Gettysburg, we are essentially bringing him here. We're conjuring him into that story of what happens on these fields in early July of 1863. Now, you might not know it, but he is literally here. If you were to go to the visitor center and go through the museum, there's a table on display about Chancellorsville, prelude to Gettysburg. And in that display is the table on which Stonewall Jackson's left arm was amputated after his wounding. And there are blood stains on that table, so we could do some cool Jurassic Park science and like pull out Stonewall Jackson if we wanted to, I suppose. But in a more metaphoric sense, every time we ask, what if Stonewall Jackson was at Gettysburg? We bring him into this story of Gettysburg, and we bring him here. The question is, what do we do with that question? And I think that's a great opportunity for us to exercise our critical thinking skills. I mean, after all, that's exactly why the Army does staff rides, is to look at what happened in the moment and extrapolate and see what we can learn. So hopefully, by the time we leave today, you guys will leave with a few things to think about that might help you understand the actual history a little bit better. Let's first start by talking about what actually happens to Jackson at Chancellorsville. You know that on the 1st of May, 1863, he leads Robert E. Lee's forces out of Fredericksburg, smashes into Joe Hooker unexpectedly, who was thinking he had the drop on Lee, and it forces Hooker to reel back and hunker down into a defensive position around the Chancellorsville intersection. You, my friend, are about to be Chancellorsville. You're seated on the front porch of the mansion, having a good time, battle happening all around you. So Robert E. Lee knows that if he goes straight at Joe Hooker, Hooker's got a tight defensive perimeter, he's got more people, he's chosen the ground. Hooker's holding all the cards. At least Joe Hooker thinks so, but the one card he has surrendered is that card of initiative. And that's always the card that Lee's looking to pick up. So on the evening of May 1st, he and Jackson pull together a pair of abandoned cracker boxes, and with the fire lighting the way, they spread the map out on the ground and they look at it, check out the positions. And into camp comes riding Lee's flamboyant chief of cavalry, Jeb Stuart. Woo, boys, I got some news for you. I've been out there scouting, and the federal flank is just hanging out there, unprotected. And Jackson stabs at the map and says, there, that's where he's going to attack. He understands that that's the most vulnerable spot because the flank is always the weakest spot of any army. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to have you step right out here. Brian, come on out here. Come on. All right, and then Steve, why don't you come out? Steve's probably been through this before. Line up straight around here. Here we have our Union Army. Fine-looking bunch of recruits, don't you say? Now, if I'm an attack and I go straight at them, how many of you guys can shoot at me right now? 5. All of them! 5 against 1, that's terrible. Lee's odds at Chancellorsville are slightly over 2 to 1. But if I come down here to the flank, now how many of you can shoot at me? One. Steve's like, I did not come all the way from North Carolina for this, right? One-on-one. At the point of contact, it's one-on-one. I still have to fight all 5 of them, but I can do it one at a time. That's why Jackson looks at the flank as the place to attack. Thank you very much. Let's give it up to our Union Army. You guys are about to have a bad day. I apologize. So, they got to figure out how to get Jackson's men over there. So Stuart goes off and he does some more scouting. Jackson's going to take a nap underneath a tree. He's going to be shivering. His staff will cover him up with a tarp. A little while later, Stuart comes back and he brings with him a guy named Charles Welford. Welford owns an iron furnace in the area. And he says, well, I can get your guys into this spot because there's a road that doesn't show up on your maps. Home field advantage. He knows that that road's there because he cut it himself to bring in wood to his furnace complex. So as Jackson and Lee talk about this, well, and Welford also says, I'll tell you what, I'll give you my son Charles Jr. to serve as your guide. So even more home field advantage. So Lee and Jackson talk about this, and what they decide is that Lee is going to stay with a portion of his army on this side of the battlefield. Just hold your attention. Woo-hoo. Look at me. Okay. See, he's falling for it. Look at that. Okay. And in the meantime, Jackson is going to march all the way around to that flank. And Lee says, well, what do you propose to make this movement with? And Jackson says, my entire corps, 28,000 men. He says, well, what's that going to leave me with? And Jackson says the divisions of Anderson and McLaws, about 14,000 men. Now, they've already split their army once. A quarter of the army under James Longstreet is in the far southeast corner of the state at Suffolk on a much-needed foraging mission. They've also left about 11,000 guys back in Fredericksburg under Jubal Early to serve as a diversion. And now Jackson's proposing to split the army a 3rd time in the face of a numerically superior foe. And Lee has to think about that for a second. He says, okay. Jackson says, my troops will be on the road by dawn. About 8 o'clock, 8:15 before they finally get going. But Lee's going to stay here. She's falling for it. Jackson's going to march on roads that don't show up on any maps to finally get over into position on the Union right flank. This is really the rear of the Union Army. Most of the fighting's all the way up there. But this army is so big, it has taken so long to get onto the battlefield that the tail end is still in this area. And Jackson's going to run out of daylight. So by 5 o'clock, he's going to launch that attack, even though he only has 2/3 of his men in position. The final one of his divisions under A.P. Hill, bringing up the rear, they're going to come in as his fresh reserves. Jackson launches that attack. Those Union troops in the flank, under the 11th Corps, they'd heard that there was movement out here. And they've been told, cook up rations. We're going after those retreating Confederates tomorrow. Hooker completely misreads the situation. So they're cooking up their rations. They've got the rifle stacked. Bands are playing. They're relaxed. And suddenly out of the woods, deer come jumping. Grouse, wild birds. Ooh, we're going to have venison for dinner, boys. And they go and grab their rifles, not realizing that something is driving those animals out of the woods. And then suddenly the rebel yell erupts out of those woods as well. And Jackson's men slam into the unsuspecting guys in the 11th Corps. The 11th Corps falls back pell-mell. Some of those men in such panicked retreat that they run past Hooker, who's standing on the porch of the Chancellorsville mansion going, who are those guys running by? And they get captured over here on the far side of the battlefield. Their retreat is so hectic that the German immigrants in that corps earn the ignoble nickname the Flying Dutchman. We'll see a repeat of some of this action just 2 months later here at Gettysburg on the fields right behind you. Now, they don't completely collapse. There are pockets of resistance that are going to slow Jackson's advance. But eventually, he'll finally get to about a mile from the Chancellorsville intersection, and the wilderness itself will stop him. This is 70 square miles of dense, second-growth, deciduous jungle. These iron furnaces that I mentioned earlier, they require a lot of fuel. And so these forests in this part of Virginia have been clear-cut to provide fuel for those furnaces. So by the 1860s, that clear-cutting has started to grow back. So it's dense, thick foliage. And so as Jackson's men try to advance, maybe you get tangled up in some brushes, you hit a stream, you run into some Yankees, you're doing okay, but he knocks into you, you're completely lost and start going in that direction. So the wilderness slows this momentum. So by about 8 p.m., Jackson's out of steam, and he has to figure out what to do next. A.P. Hill finally brings his division up as the fresh reserves. And Jackson says to him, "Press on, Hill, press on. We must cut them off from the United States Ford." That's the Union Army's route of retreat. If this is Chancellorsville, U.S. Ford is back where Sarah is. Sarah, you want to hold your hand up just for a second? So Jackson wants to cut the Union Army off from being able to retreat. Hill knows that it's going to be up to him to carry this attack forward, so he's going to do a reconnaissance mission at the same time that Jackson is also going to do his own reconnaissance. Hill just looks at the turnpike that they've been fighting along as their axis of advance, and he's going to ride out there to check things out. But the turnpike is wide open. A full moon is starting to come out. It's exposed out there. Jackson's staff says, "You don't want to go on the turnpike." And here again, home field advantage comes into play. There's someone serving under Jackson by the name of David Kyle. He's with the 9th Virginia Cavalry. David Kyle's sister actually owns a house kind of right behind you. Okay? David Kyle lives with his sister. This is literally David Kyle's backyard. And he's like, "Well, I can show you a way to get up there and check things out. There's a road that doesn't show up on your map." And so Kyle's going to take Jackson out on a place called the Mountain Road, which runs parallel to the turnpike. Jackson's going to go out there at the same time Hill is making his advance. And he rides out not quite as far as the skirmish line, but ahead of the main battle line, and he listens. You can hear off in the woods, the Federals are chopping down trees, digging. You can hear the sound of shovels, and he realizes that they're fortifying their position. And if he waits until morning to continue this attack, he's going to have to assault a fortified position. So he wants to push this attack forward tonight, even though it's getting dark, it's confusing, night attacks are pretty rare. He thinks it's going to be easier to sweep them from the field now rather than wait until morning. Hill, out on the turnpike, comes to about the same conclusion, and they begin to head back to the main line, ready to launch this next phase of the attack. And this is where the fog of war hangs heavy on Chancellorsville. And things get confusing. As Jackson was making his advance, his men run into all sorts of problems, as I mentioned. One issue they run into is a whole regiment of Pennsylvania cavalry, the 8th Pennsylvania, who are at a fight further south at the Catherine Furnace, and as they return to the line, they come up behind the skirmish line, the Confederate skirmish line, but in front of the main Confederate battle line. Now, what's the job of your skirmishers? They go out in front and clear the way, right? And if there's something out there and they bump into it, they fall back and let you know something's out there. But if they don't come back, you can reasonably assume things are pretty clear. Well, suddenly these horsemen coming in behind the pickets run into the main Confederate battle line. I was not expecting any horsemen. The horsemen realize they're in a terrible position. They try to break through and they can't. They turn, they try to break through and they can't. And they scatter, leaving behind a pile of dozens of dead horses and horsemen. So now the Confederate infantry's itchy. There were horsemen out here where there shouldn't have been. And then a little while later, a lost regiment of Pennsylvania infantry. I don't know what it is about Pennsylvanians lost in the wilderness. And they come in, groping their way through the woods, and at an angle, they miss the skirmish line and run into the southern end of the main battle line. And the Confederate, Rutro's right, totally, that was a total Scooby-Doo, Rutro. So they run into the Confederate line. The Confederates are like, "Who are you?" "Oh, you're a prisoner." Off they go. But now the Confederates are even nervous because now there have been infantry out here. And it's into that no man's land between the skirmish line and the main battle line that Jackson and his staff are now operating. And as they head back to the main line, and Hill heads back to the main line, at the southern end of the Confederate line, someone gets nervous. What was that noise? And they fire, and the guy next to him, what are you shooting at? And so this fire ripples up from south to north, even as Jackson is coming back. And he's hit, members of his staff are hit in that rolling thunder. Leading the way was his brother-in-law who served on his staff, Joseph Morrison. Morrison shot from his horse. He gets up, he says, "Stop, you're firing into your own men." And the commander there, John Berry, Major John Berry of the 18th North Carolina, veteran unit, they've seen it all. They've seen every trick in the book. There have been horsemen out here already, right? There have been infantry out here already. In a split second, he says, "It's a lie! Pour it into them, boys!" And the whole line erupts in a concentrated volley. And Jackson's hit 3 times. One bullet, nearly spent from its ricochet, hits him in the palm and lodges just under the skin, the top of his hand. Another goes in by his wrist and out by his elbow as he throws his arm up. And the third hits him 3 inches below the left shoulder. His horse bolts into the woods. His staff gets the horse under control. They ease him down. He recognizes that he's been hit. He fears that it's serious. Meanwhile, on the turnpike, everyone in Hill's party is caught in that same concentrated volley. And everyone is either killed, wounded, or has their horse shot out from under them and they're captured. Everyone but Hill himself, who dove into a ditch at the last second. And Hill hears voices through the woods, and he pushes his way, and he finds Jackson on the ground prostrate, surrounded by his staff. And Hill knows it's going to be up to him to now take over as senior division commander. But all this ruckus has attracted the attention of federal gunners back at Chancellorsville. We've got 32 guns in the clearing right here. Claremont Best certainly turns them and starts firing into the woods. And artillery shells start raining in around Jackson and his party. One of those shells will explode and hit Hill across the back of both calves, making him unable to ride his horse. And so he can't take command. So command will devolve to the next senior division commander, Robert Rhodes. And this is Rhodes' first time as a division commander. Now suddenly he's going to be expected to take over the Corps. So he's not ready for that. So he calls for help, and he's going to get assistance from the next senior Confederate commander on this part of the field. And that's going to be Jeb Stuart, commander of the cavalry. And Stuart's going to come in, take over Jackson's position. And here's really something important, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in detail in a second. So when Stuart takes over, he recognizes that this attack, although successful, has left the Confederates in an especially precarious position. Because on one side is Jackson's Corps, on the other side of the battlefield, way over here, is Robert E. Lee, and in the middle, Jim Campbell. Well, that's trouble for everybody, right? In the middle is a big, angry, wounded Union army that could simply turn and squash Jackson or turn and squash Lee if they have the incentive. So Stuart's not going to continue this attack. Instead, he's going to link up with Robert E. Lee right here, taking advantage of a piece of high ground known as Hazel Grove. The 3rd of May, he's going to start with big artillery bombardment, lots of forward charges by the Confederates. After all, that's what a cavalryman knows how to do, right? Charge! And off we go, forward assaults. Okay? It's going to be the second bloodiest day of the American Civil War, where one man falls every second for 5.
Over 4,000 casualties an hour.
Almost 18,000 casualties. By 10:30, Robert E. Lee will ride into the Chancellorsville intersection as Hooker's army collapses. His men gathered around him, their faces covered with gunpowder and sweat and tears and blood, cheering wildly for their commander, who has overcome odds of more than 2 to 1 to score what historians have now called Lee's greatest victory. It's the high point of the Confederate cause. You can walk over to Cemetery Ridge today and See the high water mark? This is it. Because from here, it's all downhill for the Army of Northern Virginia, which will never again score a major offensive battlefield victory, even though the war is going to go on for 2 more years. This is the high mark of the Confederate cause. Despite that stunning number of casualties, perhaps the one we're focused on most today is Stonewall Jackson, whom we've left in the woods, injured. As he's being evacuated from the field, that artillery rain is coming in around him, and one of those cannons explodes, killing the man who's carrying the stretcher that Jackson is on. They're carrying him at shoulder height to get him through the brush. So when the guy drops him, Jackson catapults forward, lands on his wounded arm, and it severs the artery. It begins to bleed profusely. By the time they get him to the rear, and they're able to amputate that arm, Jackson will have lost half of his blood. That's significant trauma. The operation goes well, even though the battle on the 3rd is raging. Jackson recovering okay. Prognosis looks good initially. They want to send him far to the south to a rail depot down where you're standing called Guinea Station. There they're going to put him on a train, send him south to Richmond where he can convalesce well away from the action. The train goes well. The trip to the train station goes well, but when they get there, they can't put him on the train because the train tracks have been torn up by a Union cavalry raid led by George Stoneman. One of those little bits of Civil War coincidence. Stoneman and Jackson had been roommates at West Point years earlier. So they're going to wait for the train tracks to get repaired. In the meantime, they're going to take him into a little office building, one of the plantations adjacent to the train station, owned by the Chandler family. And Jackson's going to spend a couple days there. Rain's going to pitter and patter on the roof. Recovery goes well. He thinks that God has a plan for him. He's a deeply religious man, and so he feels like God's got a plan. He can't wait to see what it is. He's going to bounce back from this and carry on as God's soldier. But on the evening of May 6th into the morning of May 7th, Jackson takes an unexpected turn for the worse. And when doctors huddle over him in the morning, they realize that he's got pneumonia, and it's pretty far advanced. And for those of you who know, like, pneumonia doesn't come on like that. But he'd been sick for days previous. Remember I told you he was sleeping on the ground and had chills and had to be covered up by a tarp. There are accounts of him on the flank march wearing every article of clothing that he owned because he was fighting off chills from a fever. Witnesses on 2 separate occasions describe him throwing up on that flank march. Doctors, despite all the attention Jackson has been getting, haven't noticed his sickness because they've been treating the wound. And the trauma has hidden the fact that something more insidious has been going on. And now that he's recovering from this trauma, they're able to see this pneumonia. And his condition will deteriorate over the next couple of days. Jackson's still thinking that God's got a plan. He's still thinking that he'll recover if it's God's will. His wife will come up from Richmond to spend a few days next to his bedside. They have a 6-month-old daughter named Julia, who Jackson does not want in the sick room. He doesn't want his baby to see him in such deteriorated condition. And so Mariana will stay by her husband's side except to go into the house to breastfeed. And they'll pray and they'll talk about the future. And, well, if something does go wrong, where do you want to be buried? And as Jackson's condition continues to deteriorate, he starts losing interest even in prayer. At one point, Mariana asks if they want to do the Psalms, and he says no. And then he catches himself and says, well, yes, of course, we should always pray when we have the opportunity. Psalm 23 was one of his favorites. If you go to the Stonewall Jackson death site today, you'll find a prayer book opened on a chair next to that, open to that particular psalm. Show pity, O Lord, and please forgive, and let a repentant rebel live. Are not thy mercies wide and free? May not a sinner trust in thee. But by the morning of Sunday, May 10th, doctors realized that Jackson is not going to survive the day. And one of the doctors attending him is his family physician from back home in Lexington, Samuel Morrison, cousin of Jackson's wife, Mariana. And he says, do you want me to tell Thomas? And she says, no, I'll break the news to you. And she goes in and she sits down next to his bedside and she says to him, if it be God's will for you to be with him today, are you ready to meet our Savior? And Jackson says, I shall be an infinite gainer to be so translated. As a deeply religious man, he felt that it was a great gift from God to be able to die on the Sabbath. And Mariana says that the doctors say that today is the day. And at first, it's though Jackson doesn't understand her, and he closes his eyes, and finally he nods his head and he says, good. I've always desired to die on a Sunday. Doctors will offer Jackson some medication to try to alleviate his discomfort, but he declines, saying that he wants to be as coherent as possible throughout the day. And he finally allows Mariana to bring the baby in. And with his bandaged hand, he puts his hand over Julia's head and he prays. He calls her his little comforter. He wanted nothing more in his life than to have a family, and there he is on his deathbed, finally getting the chance to enjoy having a child. He'll fade in and out of delirium over the course of the rest of the day, in and out of consciousness. He'll start shouting out battle orders. Send in A.P. Hill! Tell Major Hawks, get Major Hawks to... He just stops mid-sentence. His whole body relaxes. The doctor describes a smile of ineffable sweetness that comes over his face. Very quietly, very calmly, he says, let us cross over the river and rest in the shade of the trees. And he dies. Sunday, 3:15, May 10th, 1860. Now, for some people, Civil War ends on that afternoon. For some people, they want to bring Jackson here to Gettysburg, drop him in, see what happens. It's tempting to do. But I would argue that we cannot get Jackson here for a number of reasons. First of all, he's sick. Let's say he survives his wounding. Let's say he doesn't get shot at all. He's got pneumonia. He's going to have to take some time off. His chief of staff, Sandy Pendleton, suffers from pneumonia. The following August, it's going to take him a month to recover. So that's going to take Jackson out of the action. So let's say, okay, so he's sick, he comes back. Well, what has Lee done to the Army in the interim? Okay, we'll get to that in just a second. But he's probably coming back to a different situation. But let's say, like, he doesn't get wounded at all. Let's say that he's able to just continue on with the plan. A.P. Hill cut him off from Banks's fort. So, from a U.S. fort. So take a look at your map packet. And on the left, you'll see a little map that sketches out the situation of Jackson's wounding. Rides out almost to the picket line, comes back and is shot. But if we take a look at the map on the right-hand side, that's the strategic, or the tactical situation on the field when Jackson is wounded. He's got two options at that moment. Let's go straight down the turnpike as Hill is investigating, or let's cut off to the northeast and past the Bullock Farm and cut off the route to Banks Ford in that direction. Let's first look at what A.P. Hill's options are. If he goes straight down the turnpike, look, he's got Union troops on his right, the Union 3rd Corps and the 12th Corps. And on his left, he's got Union troops. So Hill, with about maybe 12,000 exhausted men who've marched all day, is going to be going right into a vice of Union troops. I don't know how that's going to work out, but I'm just guessing the numbers probably aren't in Jackson's favor in that situation. All right? Let's say he cuts up to the north, to the northeast. Well, now he's going to run into John Reynolds' 1st Corps, which has marched all the way onto the battlefield and has done more marching than fighting in this campaign. They're fresh. And I know that there are some John Reynolds 1st Corps fans here today. They do pretty well in Gettysburg. I think they've got a pretty good reputation. Let's pretend the Overland Campaign does not happen for the Iron Brigade. So Jackson's men, basically Hill's exhausted reserves, are going to run into John Reynolds, and look, oh look, there's the 5th Corps under George Gordon Meade, arguably the best fighting division commander, who's now at Corps level. Again, I don't know how that's going to work out. My guess is numerically that doesn't hash out very well for the Confederates. Okay? So when I say we can't even get Jackson to the field, like we probably can't get him off the field at Chancellorsville on May 2nd. If we look at what's actually happening on the ground. I'll take a second. One of my mottos, as some of you know, history happens in the shade. We're getting some sunlight over here. If you guys start getting warm, I don't feel bad for you at all. If you kind of migrate over here to the shade, that's quite all right. I won't be offended at all. So, first of all, I argue that the best thing to happen to Robert E. Lee at Chancellorsville is Stonewall Jackson getting shot. Because if we look at what the next stage is, if Jackson continues on with his plan, things don't look very good for the Army of Northern Virginia. So, let's say he survives. Let's say that the Army does not fall into calamity. Let's say he's sick, he comes back. What's the Army look like? Well, we know that because Jackson gets wounded, Lee takes the opportunity to reorganize the Army. He writes to Jefferson Davis and says, I've always thought that my 2-corps system is a bit awkward and have looked for an opportunity to reorganize. Jackson's wounding is the opportunity to shuffle things up. And he goes from 2 corps to 3. Does Lee still do that if Jackson's wounded? Probably, because Jackson's out for a few days because he's sick, right? So we still need to figure how to fill that leadership vacuum. So let's say that Hill and Ewell both get their promotions. Well, we all know at this point in the war, the situation between Jackson and Hill is not warm and fuzzy, right? So Hill shows up here at Gettysburg because he doesn't have Stonewall Jackson pursuing court-martial charges against him. But if Jackson's still alive, you can bet your sweet bippy that Jackson's going to keep pushing that court-martial. And so there's that whole political situation. And this is bad blood that extends all the way back to Cedar Mountain in August of '62, when Hill is first transferred to Jackson's command, because Hill couldn't get along with James Longstreet. Now, I'm not saying Jackson's at fault here, because he is, but Hill doesn't get along with people either. Okay? And the reason this bad blood exists is because Jackson prescribed an order of march toward the Cedar Mountain area, and Hill had a particular spot in line he was supposed to march in. He's supposed to follow Richard Ewell. Well, then Jackson changes the orders, and Ewell leaves by a different route. And so then Hill finds himself delayed, but nobody told Hill about the change in orders. So Jackson sees Hill. What are you doing? Why aren't you marching? You're disobeying orders. Okay? Not Hill's fault at all. Jackson still holds it against him, and that just starts the bad blood that continues between the two. There are court-martial charges pending on Hill by the time Chancellorsville happens. So if Lee reorganizes the Army, Hill probably does not get the 3rd Corps because of these court-martial charges. Hill probably is going to get sent west just like every other cast-off from the Army of Northern Virginia and become Braxton Bragg's problem. Or Braxton Bragg becomes Hill's son. So Jackson will come back and he gets the 2nd Corps back, and Ewell gets that promotion to 3rd Corps. That's probably what happens. All right? So when Lee finally moves the campaign forward in June of '63, if he's got 3 corps, and he might not even have 3 corps, maybe he just stays with the 2 corps. But my guess is the march toward Pennsylvania is going to happen differently because you have different commanders in place leading these marches. So as they move north of the Mason-Dixon line, like, okay, maybe Ewell, in charge of the 3rd Corps, now goes through 2nd Winchester, now gets up to Heritage. We can't even tell where Ewell's going to be on that march because of this reorganization. Where's Jackson in that march as part of this reorganization? So we just kind of have to, again, like, let's just pick Jackson up and put him where we want him to be. Let's forget about all these inconvenient details. We want him here, right? Let's put him over there on Oak Hill. Right? Which we can see behind. We can't quite see because of the bushes over here. But let's put him over there on Oak Hill instead of Richard Ewell. That's what we're really asking, right? And Jackson tended not to micromanage when he sent his divisions in, so Robert Rhodes probably does everything the same on July 1st, suffering terrible casualties along Oak Ridge, about 2,500 casualties. Okay? Jubal Early probably sweeps across the plain and once more hits the 11th Union Corps in the flank, driving them from the field. Again, the 11th Corps not in complete pell-mell. Go to the Brickyard, you can find out a little bit about their resistance there. But eventually, they fall back through the town behind you and over to Cemetery Hill, which is off now to my left. And let's see what actually happened on July 1st. Richard Ewell, in charge of the 2nd Corps, comes riding into town around 4:30 or 5 o'clock. And he runs into one of his brigade commanders, John Brown Gordon, who helped with that route. And Gordon is fired up, and he's like, we should continue this advance to push on and drive those Yankees off that hill. Then he also runs into James Powers Smith, coming from his staff. And Smith's like, yes, you should do this. Smith's carrying dispatches from Lee, who reminds Ewell, press your advantage, but don't bring on a general engagement. Did I say that loud enough? Don't bring on a general engagement. Everybody forgets about that phrase when we talk about July 1st. So as Ewell's trying to decide what to do, he first asks for help from A.P. Hill. He thinks, I can follow up on this advantage. I need some help from the hill on my right, and I think I can do this without kind of getting too tangled up. So Smith rides off to Lee, eventually comes back, and says there's going to be no help from Hill. Hill's men have been fought pretty hard on the western side of the battlefield throughout the day, although he has an entire division under Richard Anderson, which isn't engaged. Oh no, I can't use my fresh troops to help you. Okay, that's basically what Hill's saying. All right? So Ewell's then got to decide, should I still try to push forward and get these Federals off Cemetery Hill? And as he's making, sort of talk, and Smith also reminds him of Lee's order, but don't bring on a general engagement. Second time. Okay, but drive them off if practicable. We'll talk about that in a second too. So as Ewell's trying to figure this out, up comes Freddie Smith. He's the son of Brigadier Commander General Extra Billy Smith. And Billy Smith is posted on the York Road, which runs roughly parallel to this road, off in that direction, from where we're at, about a mile or so. And Smith says, there are Yankees out on my flank. And Smith's superior, his division commander, is Jubal Early, and Early doesn't believe him. But Smith is governor-elect of Virginia, and so even Early shows some deference to Smith, even though Early's the commander and Smith is the subordinate. And so he's like, all right, well, let's go check this out. That were sent forward by Billy Smith. They keep looking, and they don't see any Federals. We have a phantom Federal unit out here, or so Early concludes. But if you take a look at the last map in your map packet, in fact, there are Federals out there. The lead elements of Slocum's 12th Corps are coming onto the field. The division of Alpheus Williams and his 2nd Brigade under Ruger has deployed out there with the 1st Brigade under Archibald McDougall as support. There are Federals out there, and in fact, even though The Confederate commanders on this hill don't see anybody. Alpheus Williams sees them. There's a quote here from the colonel of the 2nd Massachusetts, and pardon me as I read this, but this is a smoking gun. The corps was moved to the right across country east of Rock Creek until it faced a slope toward Benner's Hill, where the line was halted and deployed with skirmishers in front. The country here was open, and mounted officers of the enemy could be seen on the high ground, apparently examining the position. Ewell and Early are right where we're at, looking in this direction, and the Federals see them. So, as Ewell's trying to decide, should he assault Cemetery Hill, he's got to be worried about his flank. We've already talked about why a flank is so vulnerable. Ewell is right to be concerned about his flank. And even though everyone decides, oh, it's just phantoms, there actually is reason to be concerned. Which, you should be worried about your flank anyway. Nobody was expecting Stonewall Jackson to show up on the flank of Chancellorsville. Right? You need to be concerned out here. But as Early and Ewell are here, they see a hill right off in this direction behind Derrick and Jess, called Culp's Hill. And there are no Federals over there. And Ewell realizes, well, we don't have to assault Cemetery Hill. We can assault Culp's Hill, and that makes Cemetery Hill untenable. And he turns to Jubal Early and he says, take that hill. And Early demurs. He says, my men, they've been fighting all day, they're tired, they're disorganized, they're tangled up and down. Have Johnson do it. And as it happens, the other division commander, Edward Allegheny Johnson, just rides up at that moment. Have Johnson do it. Well, Johnson's men are tangled up in a terrible traffic jam on the Chambersburg Pike on the far side of the battlefield. They can't get here quickly. Robert Rhodes has suffered 2,500 casualties over the course of the day. His men are not in any shape to get over here. It's up to Jubal Early to take that hill. And he demurs. And so the assignment will go to Johnson, who takes another hour or so to get his men over here. And by then, elements of Wadsworth's division from the 1st Corps are going to start to occupy that hill. And there will be Federals over there by the time the Confederates will try to take that hill. And they'll spend the next 2 days trying to take that hill. Now, if we listen to Isaac Trimble's version of this story, he's the one who sees that hill.
In the movie.
In the movie. And in his papers to the Southern Historical Society, he says, General, there is an eminence of commanding position, and not now occupied, as it ought to be by us or by the enemy soon. I advise you to send a brigade and hold it if we're able to remain. It ought to be held by us at once. And Ewell, who's been saddled with Trimble, turns to him and says, if I want the opinion of a junior officer, I generally ask. And Trimble never forgives the insult. And so after the war, after Ewell's death, Trimble comes out with this story, which is well captured in the movie Gettysburg. My favorite scene in the movie, William Morgan Shepherd. And I said, give me 1 regiment, and I will take that. And I was getting ready to stand. Begging your pardon, sir. Great scene, great scene. So we hear Trimble's version of this story. We hear Early's version of this story. We don't hear Ewell's version of this story. And so Ewell gets scapegoated for what's about to happen when in fact he saw the hill, said we need to take it, asked Early to do it, and Early said no. And then Early will spend 40 years bad-mouthing Ewell over this decision. Early wins because he lives longest, right? Campbell Brown, Ewell's stepson who served on his chief of staff, said, the discovery that this lost us the battle is one of those frequently recurring but tardy strokes of military genius, of which one hears long after the minute circumstances that rendered them at the time impractical. Those are all forgotten. At least I heard nothing of it for months and months. It was several years before any claim was put in by Early or his friends. that his advice had been in favor of an attack and had been neglected. Okay. Brown sticking up for his stepdad. Nobody said anything about this at the time. This is a stroke of armchair general. And James Power Smith, a guy I like a lot, he says that Ewell was a dependable, stalwart guy doing his best, but oh, for the inspiration of Jackson for just 1 hour. But I would argue if Jackson was here, he would have made the same decisions that Ewell made. Check my flank. I mean, like, he's like mortally wounded on a reconnaissance mission, right? We know the guy likes his reconnaissance. He would have come out here to check things out. He's the guy that just spanked the Federals at Chancellorsville by harassing their flank. He's going to pay attention out here. Okay? What Ewell does is he's got Smith's brigade and Gordon's brigade devoted to this sector of the battlefield. I suspect Jackson likewise would have had one brigade on each road to protect his flank, which maybe leaves him under strength for this assault. Where I think things would have been differently is Jackson would have turned to Jubal Early and said, take that hill. And Early would have been like, well, I can't, and Jackson would have slapped him. Right? Or at least slapped him in handcuffs and then turned to the next guy and said, you do it. Okay? We know that there ain't going to be any BS about that. Okay? That is how things might have been differently. But I argue that Ewell did exactly what Jackson would have done for the exact same reasons if we were to plop Jackson down on this field. Okay. So let's say they take that hill. Whoosh, they drive off the Federal. What happens? Oh, well, people just jump to the Golden Dome of the Capitol in the distance. We win the war, and woohoo! Confederacy wins. Remember, at this point, Meade has already staked out a line in Maryland called Pipe Creek. Okay? He simply falls back to Pipe Creek. Does Lee attack him there? Oh, attacked him here. Okay? And the other thing we have to remember is, as the Federals fall back from this position, who are the Federal soldiers that are on the field at this time? Well, we've got Winfield Scott Hancock over there. We got Howard. Okay. But we also have Slocum coming up, right? Who defended the Union withdrawal at Chancellorsville? Hancock and Slocum. You have arguably the two best Union generals in rear guard action that are protecting this fallback from Gettysburg to Pipe Creek. So I don't think there's any route on the road. And then Lee shows up at Pipe Creek. I would think, gosh, do you assault a position that Meade has already staked out for himself? My answer is no. Don't let the other guy choose the ground. Well, that's exactly what he did here. James Longstreet says we shouldn't attack him there. The fact that he's there is proof that he wants us to attack him there. We shouldn't. And Lee does it anyway. So I'm not at all convinced that Lee discovers any new wisdom when he gets down to Pipe Creek. So even though when we ask, what if Stonewall Jackson had been at Gettysburg, I don't think things turn out any different. Even if we can somehow parachute him into the scene, things don't turn out any different. I mean, even if the Federals lose here, the war continues. I mean, the Confederates lost here. The war still went on for them. But I think what's important about asking that question, aside from a cool opportunity to get together and just spitball a little history on a Saturday morning, is it challenges us to overcome our own assumptions about what we want to happen and think about what was going on at the moment and why did history happen as it did. And if circumstances were different, and they never are, because it's already history, but if they were different, what can we learn about that today? What's the lesson for me? Because it's too late for Stonewall Jackson. When we ask, what if Stonewall Jackson was at Gettysburg, we bring him into this story. And it enriches our experience here and helps us, I hope, understand what did happen differently. Thank you so much for being here with me today. If anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to